Hi everybody, my name is Jeroen van den Bos. I will be talking about political regimes in Central Asia today. Within the handbook, I am the dictatorship expert. I've been working on mostly personist regimes in the last 5 years, 7 years, 8 years, both in Sub Saharan Africa and in Central Asia. And I've been teaching courses on African politics and Central Asian politics for also 7-8 years at Adam Mickiewicz University. So today I'm going to summarize different analytical frames in how to look at the Central Asian regimes today. The presentation will be divided into 4 parts. The first part will start with the analytical frames. So 3 different approaches to look at Central Asian regimes. And we'll do almost the full historical trajectory, starting from the old pre-modern regimes, so the ones with the Turco-Mongol legacy and pre-modern Khanates. Then we'll kind of skip over the Tsarist and Soviet occupation of Central Asia because it was a very chaotic period with a lot of fast changes. Then we'll deal with the Soviet period and the contemporary regimes. Now, because of the scope of this lecture, which will be around an hour, I think, I will not be able to get in all the details, so I only highlight selected insights from the chapter, but much more details can be read there, of course. So, to start, these are the 3 analytical frames that I will be using in the chapter. So, all 3 are tied with a different dilemma. A different dilemma in the sense that there's a friction between the logic of regime dynamics, of social networks, of patronalism, neopatrimonialism, of systemic corruption networks that keep authoritarian leaders in power, and of course the dilemmas of state building, the dilemmas of implementing good governance, and also the dilemma of legitimacy in the eyes of the population. And it's for this reason that I chose 3 different frameworks. So on the one hand, we will look at Max Weber's by now ancient typology of rulership, Herrschaft, which polls the legitimacy of different states. It's a very useful but also very fluid and imprecise typology because it's based on ideal types. Then we have the more specific coding of and classification of authoritarian regimes based on the typologies of Barbara Geddes, Natasha Ezro, and Erika Franz, and their works that start from the late 90s. They have a full data set in which they classified all dictatorships around the world, and Personist Rule, which fits the Central Asian regimes, is one of them. And then we have a recent addition to the study of post-communist, but not only post-communist regimes, by Henry Hale. It's his book on Patronal Politics. And these ones look at the elements of good governance and especially the networks. And you see that the 3 theories, the 3 frames, will all look at a different aspect of a pyramid which presents a regime, a political regime in Central Asia. Of course, we cannot really go anywhere without definitions. So, the definition of a political regime that I use, it is a group of people. So we always forget, because we always think in political science that we're dealing with institutions, countries, and so on, but in essence, all of these phenomena are based on the interactions of a group of people. And this is, of course, where political science differs from sociology, is that we're dealing with a group of people that has and maintains or is fighting for political power. So it's not the social hierarchies and power relations in society, it is about political power controlling a polity in whatever form that is. So we have a group of people which of course together form a network, and this network is regulated. So they have a set of informal and formal rules. The more democratic you go, the more formalized these interactions are, but not fully. There's always limits. For instance, even democratic politics, we have the phenomenon of lobbying, which is very informal and is also a very important aspect in how distribution happens throughout the network. But it's a legal form in most countries, a legal form with kind of blurry lines, where you still have a very strong informal element in democratic politics. Another aspect is, for instance, coalition formation. So once the elections are done, you have one big party. There's usually no written rules in how the ruling coalition is made. This is also done behind closed door. There's also an informal element of a democratic polity. But the more authoritarian you go, you might have rules and constitutions, but they don't matter. So it's the informal rules that dominate and are more important. And these are the rules who allow the whole network to know who holds power, how members get selected into cabinet posts, office posts, political positions, and also how the resources of the state which are gathered are redistributed, both within the regime and distributed to society at large. So this is what how I define a political regime, and this of course has no distinction whatsoever when it comes to democracy or authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. All these are political regimes, even though the word regime, and here we are stuck with terminology, when you use the word regime, people don't mostly associate it with a democratic regime, because a democratic regime always has a pejorative annotation that it's authoritarian. But in this context, political regimes are a neutral term, as they are also in the specialized literature. And then democracy, well, since I'm not really going to deal with democracy, because all Central Asian polities and their political regimes are autocratic, it is important to highlight that depending the definition you use, be it minimalist or maximalist, you will get different results in your classifications. So this is something that students should be aware of when dealing with the classification of regimes in Central Asia. Then a final word on terminology. I use the words dictatorship, autocracy, and authoritarian regime completely interchangeable. Like some historians will definitely say that there is a difference between dictatorship and autocracy, or dictatorship and authoritarian regime, and they're right. There used to be at the end of the 19th century, but as is current in the literature today, all of these are used interchangeably, and for just the sake of style and variation, I will also keep up this current tradition. Let's start with Weber. Since we're recording in France, I decided to put Louis XIV, the Sun King here, when describing or introducing Max Weber's typology of rulership. Rulership, this is an uncommon translation of Weber's term for Herrschaft. You will also find domination or authority in the specialized literature. So probably you will find Weber's theory of domination, but rulership is actually a nuanced but a little better term. So what is rulership? Rulership is actually what keeps a state together. It's the story that has been told both by the ruling elites and is believed by the people, and with all the people in between who are surrounded by or supporting the ruler or benefiting from the system and the status quo as it is. It's a story that's been told in what is the state and who should rule it truly, rightfully. And there are different stories here. We have the ideological stories of communism, in which we are creating a new order, and we have a communist party who has the natural leadership in order to lead this revolution and transition, and therefore the leader of that party is the true ruler of that polity. In the age of monarchies, and I'm not talking about the constitutional monarchies that are left in the West today, but the real monarchies in which kings and monarchs have power, then of course is the ancient right to rule, the once divine, but then royal blood that runs through the veins of the royal family, which gives them the right to sit on the throne and rule a certain land as their ancestors have done. But of course, in democratic policies, we have the rational legal bureaucratic belief, that the belief in law itself and in procedures, and that offices are the ones that we have to adhere and listen and obey, but not the person who occupies that office. And so these are the three distinctions. But so all of these narratives of rulership are a combination of two things, which is the real power of the power holders. So they really have to show that they also control security forces and can maintain law and order in the area that they hold, plus the legitimacy given upon them by the people that they rule and also their followers and their staff. And this together gives Herrschaft, rulership. In order to show that the difference between Macht and legitimacy, for instance, is, say that you are a foreign general and you occupy lands of enemy lands, and you take so many prisoners of war. You can use your Macht, your power, to tell them what to do, but you will not have their any legitimacy in their eyes, meaning that they will not follow your orders because they are not believing in the story that they have to obey you. And this is the difference between your own troops and enemy troops that you encounter. So and this is the difference between Macht and legitimacy. So this is the willingness to obey and to adhere to a certain political order. So these are Weber's ideal types as I explained them. So the legal rational rule, which we find in legal systems, the belief in law, the Amtshierarchie, a certain hierarchy of different political positions, both appointed and elected, depending on the polity. Traditional rule, in which religious sacred laws or laws based on kingship appoint who should rule a certain polity. And then the third one, which I haven't mentioned yet, is charismatic rule. And this is the exceptional sanctity or extraordinariness of a person, a real leader that people follow. This, of course, is also an element that you can find in populist leaders. Take, for instance, Donald Trump. Even after leaving the position of his presidency, being ousted in the elections, he still has a lot of followers, a lot of people who will follow him no matter if he's doing the right thing or the wrong thing, if he has a legal right to give orders and to execute power. People will follow him. And this, you can say the same with cult leaders, with politicians, but also many of the totalitarian regimes in their creation phase, like Adolf Hitler or Lenin, had a lot of charismatic rule. But also other military generals. But not only, you also can have charismatic rule, for instance, in religious leaders that have peaceful, like Nelson Mandela or Gandhi. So charismatic rule is also not something only negative. So all of these terms are, in a sense, neutral. The problem with Weber is, of course, that they're all ideal types. And this means that the boundaries between them are not really clear. And for this reason, having only these three types is not really enough. So what I did also in the chapter is I took these three ideal types and I stretched them out on two different axes, giving us a fourth possible type. This has been done by several people before, and it's been actually used to analyze the position of secretary generals in the Soviet Union, tracing back to Stalin. So this is something, it's a Cold War analytical view on communist regimes, but I still find it very interesting and useful also to explain contemporary regimes today. So what do you get if you actually take the two axes? Well, on the first axis you have the personal, the impersonal. Are we following a person or are we following the office? And then here, is it the routine or the extraordinary? Is it following the routine, the system, the structure, or is it the agency of the persons in office or the office that actually can bring change? So in this way we have, in the second column, the more innovative and the more creative forces that both destroy and create when creating polities. And here we have the two forms that actually take these changes and implement and consolidate them in polities by making them structural, long-lasting, and in some cases pour them in law, in others pour them into the divine right to rule by creating religious cults or establishing a new dynasty and so on. So I find this a more useful way to look at political regimes through the eyes of Max Weber. A nice difference when it comes to charismatic legitimacy and institutional charismatic legitimacy. So the charisma of the office would be the difference, and I also highlight this in the chapter, between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. Adolf Hitler, he created his own political function which he occupied. He destroyed and dismantled the old political system. He came to power with his followers from the first putschs to the coup and then the Night of the Long Knives. Like, he initiated a whole series of actions to take over, gain more followers, and used enormous propaganda in order to do so. So when he created his own office, he could unmake this and so on. Like, his polity, thank God, didn't live long enough. It was ended in the Second World War, as we all know. So we cannot really say how it would have evolved if Adolf Hitler had won the Second World War. But probably something similar would happen as has happened after Lenin. And Stalin is an example of that. Stalin was not a great commander. He was not a great leader of people. He was not a brilliant ideologue that could argue the intricacies of the new communist future and a socialist heaven on earth. He was a bureaucrat. He controlled the office of cadres under Lenin. He was his protégé, and this is how he worked his way up into the nomenclatura, into the highest office. It took him several years to do, and he had many challengers, and he had to fear for his life a couple moments. But it was only after he obtained the position of the office that he was able to bend to rules and so on. But he still could never do that to the same degree as Adolf Hitler could do, because his position as Secretary General of the Communist Party was based on the whole canon of communist Marxist-Leninist ideology. So he could not go against that. He did by reintroducing religions in the Second World War in order to mobilize for the war effort. So he made changes, and he could do so with the charisma of his office. But he was still bound by the ideology that created his office and the position that he occupied. Hitler did not have this. He could easily make radical changes in politics, and nobody would be able to. There was no restraints on Hitler within his own polity. And this is the difference between these two ideal types. What about Neosultanism and Neopatrimonialism? I'm not going to go too deeply into this because I really did my effort to put this in separate boxes into the chapter. These are both the original Sultanism and Patronalism are also subtypes of Weber. So they trace back to the traditional rule. They're very extreme forms of traditional rule in which the polity is the property of the ruler. And both of these terms have been used since the 60s to describe what we actually would now call multiple contexts of modernity, of overlapping contexts or uneven interactions of modernity, in the sense that we have traditional and modern system blending. And this is something that was first noticed in Latin American politics and African politics in the 60s and the 70s. And that's where the concept of neo-patrimonial came from. So it's a blend between old and new, and also the boundary between legal bureaucratic and traditional rule. And Neo-Sultanism, a concept by Juan Linz, is an offspring and even more idiosyncratic and specified radical form of Neopatrimonialism. I will come back to Neopatrimonialism later in contrast to Patronal Politics, but all the details of this you can find in the chapter, and I will leave this for you to read. I'm not going to expand too much on that. Because there's definitely more than 3 frames to look at Central Asian political regimes, and listing them all would not be very helpful. So, the second frame is Personist Rule. This is a classification by Barbara Geddes, Erika Franz, and Natasha Ezro. How to say this? It is both a characteristic of regimes, and it's often treated as a separate regime type. And the reason is because it is an intra-regime dynamic, which after reaching a certain threshold, changes and transforms a regime to such a degree that it will start acting differently. And that once this consolidation of personalism has actually taken place, the regime can technically be treated as a separate type because it will behave in such a way. But the problem with this is that it can appear, this transition can emerge in almost every regime. Civilian single-party regimes, military regimes, and civilian multi-party regimes are all susceptible to personalizations. Monarchy is not. For reasons I also explained in the chapter, is because in monarchies you have a royal family, and going against your family in order to get absolute power would actually dismantle the strength of a monarchy, because it's the family, the closed-knit blood ties in a monarchy in which you have second-tier supporters and staff and ministers and advisors, all related, blood-related, which actually keep the collective good in mind. So they might still kill a king if a king goes off course of politics, but they will do it for the good of the family. But dismantling this family to get absolute power would actually destroy the monarchy itself. That's why monarchies do not personalize, or if they do so, they will destroy themselves. But there are not many examples left of monarchies, and the fact that they don't personalize also makes them very durable. So here we have three others. So what is this illustration about? Well, the illustration actually shows three things. They're taken from selectorate theory by Bruno Bueno de Mesquita. So the symbols, the letters mean the following. So I means incumbent, the ruler. W means the winning coalition, also called the ruling coalition in my chapter. This is the inner sanctum of the regime. So this is the tight-knit group of dictator advisors who help him rule or help her rule in some cases. And then the selectorate is the larger group from which these people are drawn. So these are people that do not have direct access to power, but it's the group either to ethnic ties, clan ties, family ties, or economic interests, or because they are local patrons or regional leaders that have some say in how politics should be done. They get indirect benefits from the status quo, from the regime, through their representatives in the willing coalition, which by themselves actually act as a sort of trade union, work union that can control the dictator. And personalism is exactly where this relation goes wrong, is when the winning coalition can no longer control the incumbent, the dictator. And here we see how I try to visualize that, is that the dictator stands above them and is no longer controlled and restrained by the actions, decisions, and especially the threat to oust the dictator himself if he does not obey the rules of the collective, the collegial body that supports him. And this is what personalism is. This is what personalism, how I treat it in the chapter. And when we get to the contemporary regimes, I will highlight what the four pillars are from Personist Rule and explain this a little bit more in detail. But since I will go to the pre-modern periods, which are mostly look at monarchy and then more at civilian communist single-party rule, I will leave the details of personalism at the end of the presentation when they're directly relevant. So, moving on, patronal politics. This is a lot of text, I'm not going to read it and so on, but I'm going to say in a nutshell what patronal politics is. Patronal politics is politics as it has always been. So Henry Hale had the fantastic approach in creating a theory which is not Western-centric, because too often we look at political and social regimes in the world and we look at them from the perspective of they're not like the West, so they're different, there's something wrong with them. But he actually looked at how regimes have always functioned, and he always found that kin ties, personal ties, contacts always mattered for any kind of political economical system in history. And that the West is actually the exception to the rule, to a certain degree, because we still have corruption, these things still happen, but they're not legal, they're outlawed. So boundaries exist, and once these boundaries are transgressed, people are into the criminal sphere. But in other places, this is more the norm than the exception. And so how do the networks are created? So you have somebody who has resources. This person takes on different clients, which are patrons in their own little mini universe, and control another different sphere. It can be media, it can be an economic sector, it can be an agricultural sector, it can be a planning sector, it can be a center that appoints political posts, it can be a center that doles out welfare. It doesn't matter what it is. Some kind of sector that can have societal influence and therefore also political power. And they dominate it by linking these patrons into an intricate network of contacts. These contacts are not fully equal, so it's based on reciprocity, but there is a hierarchy in the sense that the patrons will demand services from the clients. They will give resources in return, but it's not that the clients that work for them actually have much choice. They are also kind of arm wrestled into this, and they have to stay in, in this place. Some of them, of course, will want to move up the ladder and become more important, so there's also a constant rivalry and rebalancing in these networks. What are the three elements that make these networks work? First of all, there have to be resources that can be distributed and traded between the patrons and the clients, so resources in exchange for services or other resources. And then patrons need to have the power to enforce selectively, and they need to monitor and punish the ones who are not following and are going out of line. It's actually much easier for visualizing this, and that's what I actually did. And this also showed the difference between Neopatrimonialism and Patronalism. So Patronalism, a non-Western theory, a non-Western way of looking at different elites. It is a fantastic innovation to political science and comparative politics because it's a dynamic model. It does not merely classify how things are. It actually has the tools to analyze how the internal dynamics of networks are moving. If there's a challenger moving up the lines, if there's a consolidation phase, if you have several pyramids that are merging into one, if there's a clash. And this you can, through intensive field work and elite interviews and God knows what, methodologically difficult to get access to these authoritarian contexts and like spy through the looking glass in what's actually happening. But once you can do that, you have a theoretical frame to actually analyze what is happening here. So, and it's also very important in transnational perspective, because these networks, of course, leave the pyramid and stretch out to an international network of. So the Central Asian networks have tied to Russia. They have bank accounts in the British Virgin Islands. So the international financial network, which is global at this moment, this is also something that this theory can actually expose and help analyze. And this is something that Neopatrimonialism does not. Neopatrimonialism is like a catch-all label, which mostly looked, because it's derived from Weber, but as both an ideal type which is reduced or diluted into a classification of a regime in a certain type, but the boundaries are a little bit too blurry to really label regimes. Too many regimes are labeled into it. Both North Korea is neopatrimonial and Botswana in these theories, and the differences between them are enormous. So it has become a little bit of a catch-all concept, and for this reason I do not want to use it in this chapter. Not to say that you cannot find excellent research on Central Asia or other areas and authoritarian contexts that have used neopatrimonial frameworks and has fantastic fieldwork facts to report, but the framework as such is a little bit too blunt to really look at the intra-regime dynamics. And Neopatrimonialism also looks at everything. They look both at the elites, how society behaves and adheres to the system, and mid-level corruption. Patronalism is a little bit reduced. It mostly looks at the elites and the mid-level systemic corruption. But it doesn't care about the values in society which follow and are changed culturally because of the system. So Neopatrimonialism is also something that can be used in anthropology and in other disciplines. Patronalism is mostly a political science concept. So here we have our three frames, and this is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go through the different stages of Central Asian history, and the idea is, of course, here to show that we will look at the elites using Personist Rule. We will look at Patronal Politics using that framework by Henry Hale, and we look at the general belief systems that work through Weber's elements of rulership. So when looking at the pre-modern politics, when political science look at them, they mostly think about maybe the Scythians, although probably not so much. The Mongols, Tamerlane, Timur, Amir. And that's probably where it stops, right, for political scientists. They are not very aware of, they probably base most of their insights on the Dothraki from Game of Thrones. So this is also something that needs to be amended. But since most of the research has been done on the great steppe empires, meaning there is a very strong bias that I also will have to adhere to here. So the first thing is that there is no clean division between nomadic and sedentary polities. They both were very blurred. So of course sedentary, they did agriculture, but they used control mechanism. They hired nomads as mercenaries in order to patrol the lands they owned, guard trading caravans and so on. The nomadic tribes, the nomadic polities that were created, sometimes they were purely nomadic and isolated, but more often they interacted on a continual basis through trade and sometimes raiding with frontier oasis cities and so on in Central Asia. So they were very dependent on one another. And Vincent Fournier is definitely in his chapter going to elaborate much more on this topic, but it's definitely complex. So even if it's presented here in a reductionist way, it's because I only focus on the largest of them, the most prominent ones as the Xiongnu or Tamerlane and the Mongols. These are the huge, large steppe empires that actually were able to conquer enormous swathes of terrain in Eurasia. All these great steppe empires were what they call dual administration empires, meaning that they controlled both nomadic polities as the core of the army, but they also controlled tax bases like sedentary areas that they used for taxing and resources in order to maintain these huge armies in the field. Of course, even that got complicated when it came to winter and summer months and how they planned their campaigns. I'm not going to get into that. But a very nice concept that I would like to highlight here is the one by David Christian, the concept of Smitchka, of the yoke. And I will show that on the map right away. But the final thing that I would like to highlight is the bias that we have with the steppe empires is that, first of all, most of our research has been done on them. Political scientists look mostly at those and not at the purely nomadic, the smaller polities. And all of them have been stressing charisma too much. So they mostly look at Genghis Khan, at Amur Tamir, and they look at how these personalities, these military commanders, were able to create polities and then create dynasties. And they all highlight the exceptional qualities of these military political leaders, and they overestimate the importance of the traditional belief that was also necessary in order to maintain these polities. And because the Mongol Empire lasted for about a century, and it was not possible to do so if they were not able to create hereditary charisma and use sacred law that already everybody knew and believed in as the basis of their rulership. And this is something that I will highlight in the upcoming slides. So what is the idea of Smitchka by David Christian? It's a very elegant theory that looks at steppe empires as being composed of two units, the sedentary unit and the nomadic unit. And they look them at two oxes that are put together in one yoke, under one harness, in order to pull a cart, which is the steppe empire. And of course, they need a diligent and able political leader in order to make this match happen. This is, like in the analogy, this is the driver who uses his whip in order to keep both beasts in the right place. But they have to go into the same direction. And that is why, because that's all these empires, they didn't appear just anywhere. They did appear, like when it comes to the natural environment, at the fringes of this huge agrarian belt that runs through Central Eurasia. And these are the fringes of the belt. So this is where the agriculture ends, and we end up in steppe or desert, and then forest, taiga, tundra, and higher. And by color coding, and this is much more clear in the chapter, we will see that even the oldest polities, like the oldest Turco-Mongol polities, they all appeared at the fringes of this belt, meaning that their heartlands were always the areas where they had both sedentary populations and cultures and steppe or desert or semi-desert where they had their nomadic tribes. And that this is where the magic happened into linking those and creating this unique way of yoking together. Smitchka means yoke. These steppe empires. So if you look at the original area of the Mongol Khanate, we see that it contains here. The same with the Xiongnu, and which is this one. So this is the Xiongnu. So they're also here. Then, of course, the Turkic Khanate was much bigger, but also really overlaps with this agrarian fringe, where both climate zones meet each other. This one also exists in the south, but it has been less relevant for Central Asian politics, so I didn't add any politics there. But in the Middle East, of course, also this matters. So, what are the elements of Turco-Mongol politics? Well, first of all, we cannot talk about personalism. We have to talk about monarchic regimes in the pre-modern sense. So, what used to be the divine right of rulers to occupy the office and sit on the throne because they were chosen by God, and then afterwards turns into, mostly in the West, aristocracy, blood families, and so on. But of course, there was divinity and sacred laws that played in this at the beginning. Then we have the patronal networks, which are mostly, as we know it, as an eternal cycle of we have an empire or a polity in which we have an overlord, we have a vassal, which is in essence another patronal network, who gets stronger, observes vassals from the others, defeats in military battle using charisma their old overlord and becomes a new overlord until they themselves, over time, after several generations, are overthrown themselves by one of their own vassals. And this is the eternal cycle of vying and conflicting patronal pyramids which are happening. But they, of course, happened within aristocratic contexts. So it's not that these people came out of nowhere and so on. Most of them were from royal descent, had blood ties, had some divine blood. They had some royal links to previous rulers. And if they didn't, they would invent these things in order to create a story that would give them the right to rule. So the military, in the steppe empires, most of this aristocracy was military. So they were both military commanders and, of course, base or bek or whatever form of the same word of lord they have. They didn't have any professional staff or cadres, so it was kin and relatives who took up positions, sometimes freed slaves that would take off, or even slaves that would take up positions as trusted advisors or stewards of rulers. Most of the problems related to these regimes were related to succession. And this we see also because of the bloated aristocratic pyramid. So as soon as a polity came into power, everybody would be appointed at the top, and there would not be enough distribution of resources and political titles to go around. And this led to instability where there was more infighting between pyramids. And we see a lot of succession struggles among brothers. And this is both for the sedentary politics as for the nomadic politics. So this is really true for the whole of Central Asia. And the wider region. And this is also because they didn't have so much, they didn't have any written laws that regulated this. So they were a very fluid, informal, sacred tradition. So they had the concept of the mandate of heaven, which is Tiangmin, or in Chinese, I probably don't pronounce this correctly, leading to Tianzi, the one favored by heaven, which in Turkic language is Kut, the heavenly mandate, and Kutluk, those beloved by gods, or those put on the throne by God. But they had other systems, the system of Teru, which of course is a sort of, I explain it in detail in my chapter, is a sort of like universal sacred law that affects everything and anything. It is, it can be compared to the Buddhist Janist Dharma in a certain sense, that it's a divine law that regulates the way of things and the way of people. So this can be, it's definitely mixed up with animism, forefather religions, the presence of ghosts and sacred stones, trees, forests. So these are the sacred traditions. And these could be changed by charisma. So a charismatic leader could come in and could force a patronal pyramid to take over, realign, cast aside the old tribal alliances in order to break through, promote people from lower classes, so like take on slaves and people from without the aristocracy in order to take a top position in this new regime. But this was only for realignment. So charisma never served to overthrow this old sacred tradition. It was just to get on top of it and control a certain polity, and then hereditary charisma and sacred law would take over and reconfirm this. And this is also visible in the mandate of heaven that's been passed on to the rightful ruler generation of generation, as it's also done in other cultures, going back to the Irano-Persian cultures, Sogdian cultures, and of course the Chinese also will have this concept very much reflected and highlighted in their own historiography. So when it comes to the Central Asian polities, what do we see? Well, first of all, rulership is and stays traditional. But in contrast to the more outlying polities in Central Asia, we do not see a shift to legal bureaucratic rule or to institutionalism. So they stay very informal. They can have some custom law and some sharia, so they have some religious laws, mostly in the sedentary politics. The nomads, not so much. But it stays lowly institutionalized. So they have institutions like the Kuriltai, in which they have a collective body. They come together in order to confirm decisions of the leader, and these decisions it was a sort of legislative, like law-giving body that would come together almost every so many months. But these laws were not written. They were not passed on in a tradition of law. There were no procedures. There's the issue of the famous Yasa, or like the elusive Polish, Mongolian law, which I also write about in the chapter. But this is also more like a wrong interpretation from outside looking in. And so low institutionalism, and over time we see a shift to Islamic legitimacy. So as the bloodlines from Genghis Khan and his descendants start to become more and more diluted over the centuries, we see at the same time a stronger shift to Islamic legitimacy and Islamic credentials in order to create a story on which certain politics in Central Asia base and found their rule. And charisma in all these cases serves to overthrow temporarily the existing order, make changes, get another pyramid at the top, and then reinstall it using the same traditional rulership, the same traditional Herrschaft, and also the sacred traditions that were already there in order to confirm this state of affairs and the new status quo. Then we enter the quite difficult Tsarist occupation and then the Soviet occupation. I actually just included a couple maps to show that where the Central Asian polities were at. So these are all maps that were created for the handbook. So these are the correct numbers. So they can be found in the 8th chapter. So as the Tsarist forces from Muscovite Russia were slowly encroaching from the north, we still have the nomadic Turkomans, the nomadic Kazakhs, the Dzungars, and then the Uzbeks, partly nomadic, partly sedentary. We had the Bukhara Emirate, which would lose a lot of terrain through the enormous Kokand Khanate, which would rise up swiftly in the span of 1 century and then decline and be eradicated fully with the Tsarist occupation 1874, if I'm not mistaken, 1876. And then the Khiva Khanate. So this is the reality of how Central Asia was conquered. This is another map in how the Russian Tsarist forces advanced by 1711 till 1864, and then the dates of conquest, while the British were doing the same, coming from British India, the failed Afghan campaigns, and then the geopolitical fighting to control Persia. The British had an influence zone which is lower, but is not shown on this map. And then by 1920, after the Russian Revolution, some of these polities still exist. So the Kokand Khanate has disappeared. It was undone by the Tsars. But we still have the Bukharan, Samarkand polities, which are mushed together in the Bukharan People's Soviet Republic. And then Khorazm People's Republic, which was the old Khiva Khanate. And then slowly we have the redivision of Central Asia into new polities. So here we really see that the abolishments of the last monarchies, the Emirate and the Khanate, these are abolished in the regions. Soviets are created. And yeah, these are so many transformations that happen in a relative short time that it's very hard to pinpoint their regime workings. And also, since these polities were no longer independent, although they had a lot of autonomous periphery, and they even could contain their own laws until the advent of the Soviets, it's very hard to put these in the chapter. So this is definitely a scope that is underlighted in the chapter, but I recommend the works by Scott Levy, especially to look, or Alexander Morrison, on the Tsarist conquests and the details and how these politics tribes function, traded, and to look at them through different lenses. So I will move on directly to the third part, Central Asia in the Soviet period. And I also will only give a snapshot, so I'm not going to give the full evolution, but I will just highlight how we can actually analyze what was going on, even if their politics were not independent. So here are the territorial divisions lasting from 36. Almost no changes to the borders would be made until independence, and this is how Central Asia also reached independence. So here we have 5 huge transformations that really changed political and social and cultural life in Central Asia. First, the establishing of the political control, abolishing the old emirate and the khanate, and also the nomadic khanates, of course. We have the decolonization, the overthrow of the old religious elite and the aristocracy in these politics, in these polities, and replacing them by committees, both staffed by natives and by Slavs that were sent to the region in order to bring law and order and governance based on Soviet values and ideology. Then we had the huge and very bloody collectivization of Central Asia. Then we had the delineation, of which I showed how we went from this map to this map. That took quite some changes, of course, which are also explained mostly in the 8th chapter of the handbook. And then the nativization of cadres, especially after Stalin, in which natives can rise in the ranks of the nomenclatura and within their new 5 new titular nation states, which are freshly created based on aligning older and more complex identity formations that existed before. So what do we have? Can we talk about personalism? Not really, because without real independence we cannot talk about personalism. And this is also where patronalism comes in handy, because we can look at the patronal pyramids which were created in this area. We had national party leaders in almost all Central Asian countries who dominated enormous networks and resources. There's the enormous corruption scandal under Brezhnev with cotton that reached out transnationally all the way to Moscow. Even Brezhnev's son-in-law was shot for it in the end, if I recall correctly. So because of their peripheral autonomy but not independence, patronal networks existed and thrived after Stalin's death all the way until Andropov, Gorbachev. So it's only in the 80s that they became dismantled when the reforms of the late Soviet period were imposed upon these polities. So these enormous pyramids, of course, they were staffed with apparatchiks, which of course they were local elites, they were clan leaders, they were the leaders of kolkhozes, which used to be a clan. So it's the nomadic way of life was undone, and the collectivization forced a lot of these older identity markers in sedentary context of kolkhozes, sovkhozes, villages. But that doesn't mean that these informal structures, these social structures, that they disappeared. They were not officially recognized. They existed in parallel, but they were, condoned in the sense that the Soviet rulers, especially in the 20s, 30s, knew that they had to adhere to those in order to keep order in what was the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union, when there was still a lot of potential insecurity, either from geopolitical tension up until the Second World War, but also the Basmachi uprisings in the south of the region. So the informal institution state. And rulership, of course, was based on ideology. And here we see this beautiful example of institutional charismatic rulership, where it's the person and his position in the nomenklaturen, his office or her office in some cases, that actually gave political power and gave people the potential or the agency to act as a patron in these patronal pyramids. And this, of course, because they were not fully independent, cannot be equaled to personalism, because at any time somebody in Moscow could make decisions, and many of these first secretary generals were led away in chains at the late 80s, mid-80s, which made a result in a complete realignment of their patronal pyramids just before independence. And so patronalism is a useful way of looking at it, but of course we should not underestimate the legal bureaucratic way of doing, of governing in the Soviet Union. So everything was based on ideology and the belief in, in the ideological project, at least formally. Informally people thought what they thought. But when it comes to governing the policy, laws, procedures, these were very important and also very restrictive in order to, there was a lot of paperwork to keep people in place so they should do what they wanted, what the Kremlin wanted them to do. So we see a huge institutionalization of Central Asia that has never been before into the area. Not even if you look at the old Khanates or the Emirates, they never had this level of institution. They were much more behind compared to the Ottoman Empire or to the Chinese Empire or the Mughals in India. These had much more elaborate state apparatuses that had already enormous improvements based on the drive to modernize that Central Asia didn't lack completely in the 19th century. So, with this in mind, how should we look at Central Asia after independence? Well, here we can talk about personalism. And here, since these are my last slides, this is where I will say a little bit more about personalism, although most of it is described in the chapter. The thing is, I don't want to go too deep into these aspects of personalism for the reason that they don't really differ between the countries. So the analytical value is important in order to understand Central Asian politics as they are, but in order to make a comparative analysis of them, all of these things are quite similar, except for a couple. So coup-proofing, for instance, is how these regimes protect themselves from enemies from within the state apparatus, from within the military, from other elites who are within the inner sanctum of power, so they cannot take over. But here the Soviet legacy, and especially the legacy of having parallel systems with KGB and secret police well integrated in all aspects of police and military, they inherited this legacy. So Central Asia has never been that prone to coup d'etats as other world regions. And I'm thinking especially about Latin America, the Caribbean and Africa, but also the Middle East or South Asia actually, if you look at the 60s, the 70s and afterwards. So the reason is because they have this Soviet legacy of political control on the military pillars of the state. Repression, well, a lot of repression. Here, of course, regimes differ. And they repress as much as they need. Weaker regimes will repress more selectively. And they try to mitigate tensions by having more institutions like parliaments, elections, which are not democratic, but are a way to channel dissent and also control who is who needs what and so on. It's also to realign the patronal networks. They use the electoral and the legislative institutions, so they look more like democracies. The stronger polities, and I'm thinking mostly about Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan here, they don't need these. They have enough state control and security services to keep their population in check. Although Uzbekistan has a huge population, so they're more paranoid in this regard than Turkmenistan. They use very harsh repression. Most of it was almost random. So they will randomly arrest people, torture them into confessions in order to create a terror regime, like impose state terror on their population so people would stay in line. Kazakhstan has been a little bit more elaborate out it by mostly targeting journalists, investigative journalists, opposition leaders and so on. But of course they have gone to government killings or extra-legal assassinations and definitely arrests and so on and breakdowns and state protest breaking in order to mitigate this. Tajikistan has also gotten much more repressive after 2015. And of course, they had a very violent civil war until '97. So this, most of this repression still has to relate into the aftermath of that. Then we have gatekeeping. Gatekeeping is how a dictator mitigates its international relations in order to have no foreign interference, but can still play off great powers against each other in order to get into the best position. This is a theory created by Jacob Tolstrup, based on the old linkage leverage framework by Levitsky and Way. I find it very useful, although it's very labor intensive to apply this framework on regimes, because there are so many dimensions. You have the social linkages, you have the economic linkages, you have the geopolitical linkages, you have the media and communication linkages, and then the transnational NGO and other linkages. So it takes quite some research to highlight how these ties are manipulated. But for instance, to give an example, opportunities shifted when the war in Afghanistan broke out, and the US needed a place in order to launch their operations, their military operations for Operation Enduring Freedom. So both Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan used their strategic leverage in order to reduce pressure and critique on their undemocratic practices by offering them military bases. So one was in Kant, the other was K2 in South Uzbekistan. Turkmenians did the same, but they didn't really make it public. So they gave flyover and refueling possibilities on Turkmen soil, but they kept that under wraps. But of course, this way they also avoided criticism, especially on freedom of speech, human rights, and so on. Most Central Asian states that export a lot of oil or gas, they don't have much critique anyway. Like, they have critique, but it's always diluted by the fact that they are the main providers for energy. And this is where Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan are in such prime positions, and especially Turkmenistan by also exporting so much gas to the EU through Turkey and so on. And then the final characteristic is the hoarding. How these elites, how these patronal networks take in these resources and distribute them. And the idea behind hoarding in personalist regimes is that you don't give too much back to your followers, because if you give too much resources back, you will enable your followers to build up independent patronal pyramids. So the more you keep to yourself will, in the short term, create friction and animosity and among your followers, your staff, but on the medium term will make it impossible for them to gather enough resources and attract enough people and followers to overthrow you. And this is what the hoarding is about, and this is very typical once you have competing patronal pyramids and they are shaped into one huge pyramid, which then can also be considered a personalist regime in the understanding of Barbara Geddes. So we have, of course, an exception to this. Kyrgyzstan, these pyramids are always realigning. The deal was clear in 2015 in Tajikistan, but the pyramids in Kyrgyzstan, as we saw now again in 2020, with a third popular uprising, which is of course elite-sponsored, elite-driven, and elite manipulated where they can. These are local pyramids realigning around a new patron. There's a huge north-south division, but it's much more complicated than that. So these things have to be studied. So Kyrgyzstan here is the exception. When we look about rulership, Central Asia lost its sacred traditional rulership based on royal blood and ancient belief systems of Tengrinism, animism, and so on. They lost their ideological basis of communism after communism was internally busted as an idea and then economically collapsed. So while some of them still keep the same form of it when it comes to the Soviet style of ruling, they actually are looking for new ways to legitimize their regimes. And since for the first time in history, they are no longer monarchic, but they actually are truly personalist, meaning that the elites are never been so small and so exclusive as in any other polity before in Central Asia. So they are actually desperate in order to keep the story going. And for instance, Rico Isaacs has identified several ways of self-legitimation strategies in how these regimes try to promote their system of rule. So one is reaching back to the traditional system, the old khanates, the old polities, the old military commanders, Timur Lane, Manas, and so on. They of course use their own charismatic personality as first presidents, of which some of them are still in charge, at least behind the screens. And then of course the last way is by providing some benefits to the population where they can. Some countries do this better as others, like Turkmenistan up until a couple of years ago provided, they reduced prices for bread, gas and so on to their population. But this system has also collapsed in the last 3 or 4 years, and they also had hunger riots and problems. So their legal bureaucratic providing services in order for legitimacy has also failed. Kazakhstan is now the leader of the bunch and does quite well, but of course this is mostly like in the urban areas, and in the villages and the countryside this also is not. So what are the insights that also will highlight is that the independence, which I will not describe here, can to some degree be compared to Western Africa and the decolonization of some of these former French regimes, like colonies that actually did not wish for independence and wanted to stay within the orbit of France because it gave them more benefits as the elite networks that they were. Although there are as many differences as similarities there, so but it's an interesting comparison. Another thing is we still have no regime turnover in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. It's not because we have a new leader that we actually have new regimes. So Tokayev that took over in 2019, Nazarbayev is still in charge to a huge degree behind the screens, although he doesn't hold a formal office, which also stresses the informality of these regimes. Of course, Karimov died in 2016, and there was a succession struggle. But very swiftly, this regime took over, and most of the same elites under Karimov have been. Only the challengers to Shavkat Mirziyoyev have been eliminated. And this is the same in Turkmenistan. After Niyazov died, Berdimuhamedov, he also got rid of his challengers within the regime. But this is just a purge. This is not a new regime. And so it's only in Tajikistan, and especially in Kyrgyzstan, that we see multiple regimes. And Tajikistan only knew 2 regimes. We had the Nabiev regime and then the Rahmon regime. Still, no coups, no coup d'etats. There have been some attempted coups by Karimov at the time of the civil war in Tajikistan, but they were externally sponsored. But we don't have any internal coups in Central Asia. There have been some terrorist attack on Karimov that was highlighted as such, but this is, not really the case. So succession remains. In order to really fully study these regimes in Central Asia, we actually need to find out how they're going to evolve, how they're going to deal with real regime change, and how this is going to define the region as a whole. But with the authoritarian context, with a very autocratic China and autocratic Russia, gatekeeping is so easy. So to sponsor democracy from the West to these areas is completely impossible, because it's so easy to use these 2 autocratic superpowers and the rest of the autocratic region to block any kind of reforms and wishes. But how they will mitigate these personist regimes, because of these 4 pillars, you can use all 4 if you have a very able regime. You can, 3 are usually enough in order to stay in power. You can balance on 2 for a while, but you cannot stand on 1. So as resources dry up or opportunities change or the international order shifts, we will have to see how these regimes can actually function, and if coup d'etats will suddenly become an issue, if they can maintain up their levels of repression without triggering armed response from the population. So this we will still have to see, but we are talking mid-term here. So I'm thinking 10, 15 years is the frame in which we might see some changes in these regimes. And even then, some of these regimes, personal regimes in the similar authoritarian context, like North Korea, they have been dual for decades. So what we have in Central Asia is in no regard that different from some regimes that we have in Africa, that we had in Latin America, and that we still have in East Asia. So change is not really around the corner at this moment. Just to highlight the complexity, because these frameworks that I gave are all frameworks that actually highlight the similarities between these regimes. But I very quickly also want to highlight the differences between them. And they're in detail described in the chapter. So when it comes to the resource curse intensity, so how resources, petroleum, gas, mining can be used in order to maintain regimes, we see that Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan are definitely in the best position, then Uzbekistan, but that Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, both with one main mining sector, are definitely at a disadvantage in order to get income from these mining rents in order to maintain the regime. So there's much more regime infighting there in order to get access to wealth and rents. When we look at the stable pyramids, well, before 2015, only these three countries had actually stable pyramids. And we even see the difference between Niyazov, who actually was and remained in charge since the early 80s from the Soviet regime, and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, who actually were the new Soviet Guard that came to power just before independence after the realignments created by Yuri Andropov and Mikhail Gorbachev. So even these regimes took longer to stabilize and really build out their patronal networks. Kazakhstan did in the early 2000s, Uzbekistan by the late 90s. This was not the case with Turkmenistan, which from the beginning already had its pyramid intact and there was no opposition, which also means it's a regime which is as isolated and as repressive as North Korea. And then, of course, this shifted after 2015 with the pyramid of Tajikistan also stabilizing after Rahmon took over and consolidated power and also got rid of political mandates. So these are only some of the many differences between, and these differences cannot really be caught. Like here we have to look at patronal networks and patronal pyramids in order to mitigate these intra-regime dynamics. But personalism, they're all personist. So this is one label that allows us to look at all of us, but it's a little bit too broad. And for this reason, I refer to these four pillars of personalism to make it more complex and study it. I refer to patronalism and also to Weber's offspring theories developed by others in order to look at how these regimes try to stay in power and what story they try to tell in order to keep their followers from attacking the presidential palace. So I'm going to stop here. So what I did actually was I gave three frames that can be applicable more or less throughout the whole Central Asian history. They're more snapshots than a full historiographic overview. Some aspects have been biased because we have more information. So the Soviet period, we have more information of that. We have more information about the great steppe empires and not so much about the small khanates, which were purely nomadic and didn't interact much. So much research is needed there, especially from political scientists, even if historians are catching up there. And then Central Asia today, we still don't know a lot. And we also should know that because these regimes only become independent in the 90s, we're dealing with 30 years of independence. This is not so much. 3 decades to study new countries and how they're going to behave politically. So it really pays off to make comparative analysis to other world regions and try to see what matches. And here the Middle East and some options in how they manage their resources, wealth, petroleum, might also be interesting comparative frames to study contemporary regimes in Central Asia. So this is it. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. And like the chapter also will make more links to other chapters that actually will dive much deeper into many of the issues that I only touched upon this. This whole chapter and this lecture is only a stepping stone to start researching political regimes in Central Asia. It's definitely not the end of the story, it's mostly the beginning. There's much more frontier research going on, and area studies and field work will yield in new results. But what my intention was is to give some methodologic and theoretical clarity in what are the best or the most useful concept to tackle the region in analysis and to maybe warrant some carefulness regarding older concepts like Neopatrimonialism, Neosultanism, which are current and can be found in the older literature, but which are not as analytically clear or parsimonious as the 3 theoretical frames that I provided here. So thank you very much, and good luck with researching political regimes in Central Asia. So.